You have $100, not $10,000, not a lucky inheritance from an uncle you barely knew, not a bonus that landed at exactly the right moment and made you feel clever, just $100, the kind of money that disappears over a weekend without leaving a mark, the kind of money people spend on things they cannot even remember by Monday morning. The kind of amount that feels too small to matter and too tight to spare at the same time. That is where this begins. It does not begin with a grand strategy. It does not begin with a perfect spreadsheet, a polished brokerage account, or 6 months of reading until you feel ready. It begins with $100 and a decision so small it almost feels embarrassing compared with the size of the future you hope to build. I want to say something to you as plainly as I can. Most fortunes do not begin at a dramatic scale. They begin at a scale so unimpressive that the world ignores them. That is one of the reasons they work. Small beginnings do not attract applause. They do not attract envy. They simply leave room for repetition. And repetition is what builds wealth. So you make the decision, you set up the automatic transfer, you pick the index fund, you stop waiting for the perfect answer, because waiting for the perfect answer is what kept you from doing it last year and the year before that. You click confirm and then almost nothing happens. The account shows $100, the market wiggles a little, maybe it goes up a fraction, maybe it goes down. Maybe your $100 becomes $99.70 by bedtime. You check it 3 times before you go to sleep because you expected a feeling and what you got instead was a number. This is the beginning, and it looks nothing like the fantasy people sell. The account sits there. Every month you feed it another $100 like a plant. You are not fully sure is alive. Some months the number rises, some months it sinks. 6 months pass and the balance says 500 and something. You knew the math when you started. It is roughly what it should be. It is not a number that changes your life. It is not a number you tell people about. It is just a quiet number. Inside an app, this is the part nobody celebrates because there is nothing visible to celebrate. But I have lived long enough to tell you that the invisible phase is where almost everything important is decided. The first 6 months of investing $100 a month are not exciting because the money has not done much yet, but you have done something important. You have begun to teach your own mind that a repeated act matters even before results appear. That lesson is worth much more than the balance on the screen. Habits, before they produce results, produce only themselves. That is why most people stop. They do not stop with a grand announcement. They do not issue a formal declaration that they no longer believe in long-term investing. They simply miss 1 month because things feel tight. Then another month, then the account sits still, then they stop checking, then they stop thinking about it. Then a year disappears, and what died was not the portfolio. What died was the rhythm. I do not say this to judge anyone. I say it because human nature has a terrible weakness for abandoning things that have not yet started rewarding us emotionally. The gap between knowing what to do and continuing to do it while nothing visible is cheering you on is where most people quietly leave the field. If you keep going, you begin to separate yourself from that crowd. At the end of the first year, you have contributed $1,200. Maybe the account shows something like $1,300 and a little extra if markets were decent. That extra gain is not life-changing. You could make it with a bit of overtime or a side job. If you look only at the gain, you miss the deeper point. The real gain of year one is not the $112 or whatever the market gave you. The real gain is that you proved to yourself that your life did not collapse without that $100 each month. That is a bigger lesson than people realize. Most people do not really know whether they can afford to invest because they have never tested the question seriously. They assume the money is load-bearing in their monthly life. Then they try it, and month after month they discover something uncomfortable and useful. The $100 felt essential. It usually was not. It was simply the amount attached to habit, convenience, impulse, and all the little leaks that money always finds when you do not assign it a job. When you redirect that $100 12 times and your life keeps functioning, you have learned something about yourself that no market chart can teach you. You have learned that discipline is often cheaper than fear told you it would be. By the second year, something begins to shift. You are no longer checking the account in the same emotional way. In the beginning, you looked at it as if you were waiting for a diagnosis. Now you look at it with a kind of quiet curiosity that change matters. The person who checks an account with fear and the person who checks it with curiosity might own the same fund, but they are not going to behave the same way in a bad market. And bad markets always come 1 year, maybe in your second year, maybe later, the market drops in a way that makes your stomach tighten. You watch the balance give back several $100s. Suddenly, the number that felt like progress starts sliding backward. This is where many people reveal what they actually believe. If they were investing because they expected a smooth upward line, they panic. If they were investing because they understood the machine, they continue, you make the transfer on schedule because the schedule does not negotiate with headlines. Your $100 now buys more shares than it did 3 months ago because prices are lower. You do not feel heroic. You do not feel excited. You simply keep doing what you said you would do. That is one of the most underappreciated forms of intelligence in finance. Not brilliance, not prediction, not genius. Just the refusal to interrupt a sound process because the emotional weather changed. When the market recovers, as markets tend to do over enough time, the shares you bought during that ugly period become some of the best purchases in the account. The down months were not an interruption to compounding. They were part of it. That lesson repeats for the rest of your life. The market frightens people into selling future gains at a discount. If you can keep buying when the price tags are lower, you stop being the victim of volatility and start using it. 3 years in, maybe you have put in $3,600 and the account has grown to something meaningfully above that. There is now a visible gap between what you contributed and what the market has added. It is still not dramatic enough to impress fools, but it is real enough to impress a thinking person. That is when you begin to understand something that very few people really internalize. The money you contributed was never the whole story. It was only the ignition. At first you are doing almost all the work. Then time begins helping. Then time begins doing a larger and larger share of the work. Eventually the account behaves like a second contributor, like a silent partner who deposits money without asking your permission. That silent partner is not talent. It is not luck. It is not a secret stock tip. It is time attached to disciplined repetition. When I was young, people often wanted a dramatic investment idea. They wanted the hidden gem. They wanted the special situation. They wanted something that sounded smarter than patience. Most of them were really asking for a way around discipline. There isn't T1. The machine that turns $100 into something significant does not require brilliance. It requires duration. 5 years pass. You are around 29 or 30 or wherever your own calendar places you. You have contributed $6,000. Maybe the account is around $8,000 or so, if long-run averages cooperated. Some people will look at that number and shrug. They will say $8,000 is nothing in the context of real wealth. That response is technically neat and psychologically foolish because $8,000 is not the point. $8,000 is the proof. It is proof that something can be built from almost nothing without a windfall, without a perfect income, and without some heroic financial sacrifice that makes life miserable. It is proof that small and repeated beats large and delayed. It is proof that you are capable of consistency even when the feedback loop is weak. And perhaps most importantly, it is proof that the identity has started to change. The richest thing you own after 5 years is not the account balance. It is the evidence that you are the kind of person who funds the future before the future becomes urgent. That identity compounds too. Now your relationship with money starts changing in ways that outsiders do not see. You become harder to impress with consumption, not because you are stingy, because you understand cost differently. Now, every discretionary purchase still has its place, but you no longer evaluate it only by sticker price. You evaluate it against a machine. You have spent years feeding, you know what $100 does when left alone, for decades. Once you know that, certain spending still feels worthwhile and certain spending starts feeling ridiculous. You also become calmer. That may be one of the greatest hidden returns in all of this. The world around you is still full of noise, still full of panic, still full of people who lurch from greed to fear depending on what the market did this week. But you now have years of memory. You have watched the line rise, fall, recover, stall, and rise again. You no longer assign eternal meaning to a single ugly Tuesday. That calm is worth a lot. I have seen people with far more money than you live in permanent agitation because their money relationship was never repaired at the psychological level. And I have seen people with moderate means live with much more stability because they had built a process that made sense to them. Peace of mind does not come from the size of the pile alone. It comes from understanding the machine that produced it. 10 years pass. Now, you are in your 30s, maybe your mid-30s. You have contributed $12,000. The account may be around $20,000 or a bit more if returns were roughly in line with long-term market history. Now, the numbers start changing your internal story. The market is no longer adding a trivial amount. In a decent year, it is adding more than what you contribute. That is an extraordinary threshold. For 10 years, you were the senior partner and compounding was the junior one. Then slowly, quietly, the junior partner grew up. Now the machine is producing more in a year than you are putting in by hand. If you have never experienced that moment yourself, you may underestimate how powerful it is. Until then, investing feels like sacrifice with a delayed promise. After that, it starts feeling like collaboration. You begin to see that the account does not merely store your behavior. It rewards it. The reward is not guaranteed on your schedule. It does not come politely every quarter in a straight line. But over enough years, the broad trend begins to overpower the noise. That is why time matters so much. It is not that time makes every decision good. It is that time gives a sound decision enough runway to reveal what it actually is. At 10 years, most people around you still will not understand what you have built. That is fine. They are not supposed to. A process this ordinary always looks unimpressive from the outside until enough years have passed that the result can no longer be dismissed. There is another thing happening by year 10. You are becoming less dependent on motivation. In the early days, you needed emotional reinforcement. You needed reminders, podcasts, inspiration, the occasional story to keep the belief alive. By year 10, you are running on structure. The transfer happens because it happens. The process survives your moods. That is when financial behavior gets very strong. Systems beat moods every time. 20 years pass. Now we are in truly interesting territory. You have contributed $24,000. The account might be around $76,000 if it compounded at roughly 10% on average over a long period. That means the market has added far more than you ever personally deposited. Now the account is doing serious work. In an average year, the gain may be several $1,000s. That is no longer symbolic. That is real money. That is money that can change choices. That is money that can cushion shocks, fund transitions, create options, and reduce pressure. And year 20 is also where something very important becomes visible. The acceleration is just beginning to show its face. Compounding is easy to underestimate because the first half of the journey does not look like the second half. The first half feels quiet, heavy, almost stubbornly slow. The second half begins to feel alive. People who quit early never really saw the thing they were building. They saw only the awkward early stage. They judged a mature machine by the appearance of its childhood. That is one of the great tragedies in personal finance. People abandon the process before the mathematics becomes emotionally convincing. By year 20, the mathematics has become emotionally convincing. If your account earns $7,000 in a year while you contribute only $1,200, you are no longer building wealth primarily through effort at the margin. You are building through accumulated capital and time. That shift is what opens the door to actual financial flexibility later in life. But let me say something else, because this is where people sometimes misunderstand the lesson. The lesson is not that $100 a month is enough to solve every financial problem. It is not enough to guarantee some fantasy of effortless wealth. It is enough to prove the principle. It is enough to build a base. It is enough to make later increases matter much more, because once a person has the habit, raising the amount becomes easier than starting the habit ever was if life improves. And you can raise the monthly amount to $200 or $500. The machine gets stronger fast. But the reason that later increase works is that the identity and the rhythm were already built with the first 100. Most people think the breakthrough amount comes first and the habit follows. It is almost always the other way around. The habit comes first, the bigger amount comes later. The waiting crowd gets that backward and loses years because of it. 30 years pass. Now, you are in your 50s. You have put in $36,000. The account may be around $220. $7,000 at long run average returns. The market has produced far more than you deposited at this point. The machine is not merely interesting, it is powerful. In an average year, 10% on that sort of balance is over $20,000. That is close to $2,000 a month in growth before taxes and before any withdrawals. Think carefully about that. You spent 30 years putting in $100 a month. Now the account is capable, in a decent year, of adding roughly what many people spend to live for a month. And you are not done. That is the part that still astonishes people who have not lived it. The later years matter disproportionately because the capital base has become large enough that modest percentages translate into large real dollar gains. If I had to explain compounding to a young person with no charts and no formulas, I would say this. In the beginning, you are hauling bricks. Much later, the wall starts building itself faster than you can carry bricks to it. The mistake is thinking the first bricks did not matter because the wall was still short. By 30 years, you also begin to see the emotional payoff of all the years. You were not forced to become desperate. Desperation is expensive. It makes people borrow badly, sell badly, chase badly, and compromise badly. A steadily built asset base does something more important than just grow. It reduces desperation. It gives you room. It gives you time to think. It gives you the ability to say no to some bad deals and yes to some good ones. Optionality is one of the highest forms of wealth. 40 years pass. Now, you are around traditional retirement age. You have contributed $48,000 total. The account may be around $637,000 if the broad market delivered something close to historical averages over that full span. Stop there and really look at the proportions. $48,000 came from you. Nearly $590,000 came from time, markets, reinvestment, patience, and the single greatest financial habit you ever built. That is what $100 a month can become, if it is paired with decades and not interrupted. Most people, when they hear that number, focus on the end figure. I do not. The end figure matters, but that is not the most important part of the story. The most important part is the set of decisions that looked trivial at the time they were made. Every month felt small. Every transfer felt ordinary. No one congratulated you for it. There were no headlines about your discipline. No social signal rewarded it. Sometimes the account rose. Sometimes it fell. Sometimes you doubted it. Sometimes you ignored it. Sometimes life got tight and you kept going anyway. Sometimes life got comfortable and you kept going then too. All of that ordinary repetition became something extraordinary because ordinary repetition is exactly what compounding needs. Now let me say the thing that is more important than all the balance projections. This is not really about the money, or rather it is about the money in the same way a seed is about the tree. The seed matters. The tree is the point. What you actually built over those 40 years was not just $637,000. You built the version of yourself that does not require a dramatic event to change direction. You built a person who understands that large outcomes often come from boring inputs. You built proof that consistency outruns intensity when intensity cannot be sustained. Most people spend their lives waiting for a bigger moment, a bigger paycheck, a bigger break, a bigger amount to invest, a bigger reason to take themselves seriously. That bigger moment either does not come or it comes too late to matter as much as they hoped. Time was the real asset. Time was the thing they were spending while they were waiting to begin. You did not wait for time to become convenient. You put $100 beside it and let the two of them work together. That is why the small amount mattered so much. Small and consistent is not what people do when they cannot do something more impressive. Small and consistent is the engine itself. It is the mechanism. It is the reason big and eventual can exist at all. The person investing $100 a month is not losing to the person who promises to invest much more someday. In most cases, the first person is winning by a mile because someday is not an investing schedule. I have spent my life around capital allocation, business decisions, market cycles, and all the other things people think create wealth. Those things matter. But one of the most important truths I know is very simple. The size of a smart decision does not determine its worth. The repetition of it does. $100 is not magical. The market is not magical. There is no fairy dust in the SP 500. What is powerful is the repeated conversion of intention into action over a very long period of time. That is why this works. You are not outsmarting the world. You are simply refusing to waste the one force the world cannot negotiate with, which is time. And here is one more thing most people do not realize until much later. When you invest $100 every month for long enough, the financial result is only half the payoff. The other half is that you stop living entirely at the mercy of the next paycheck. You begin to participate in ownership rather than only labor. You become someone whose future is not built only by hours worked, but also by assets owned. That is a profound shift. That is how a person slowly moves from dependence to leverage. Leverage used wisely is one of the great builders of wealth. Not reckless leverage, not borrowed money for foolish speculation. I mean the leverage of capital that continues working after the original effort is done. That is what your monthly $100 buys. It buys future labor from capital. There are people who will hear all of this and still say the amount is too small to matter. They will miss the point completely. $100 is not competing with a windfall. It is competing with inaction. Against inaction, $100 a month is overwhelming. Against waiting, it is a masterpiece. Against drift, it is a map. Against the lazy fantasy that wealth starts when the amount gets larger, it is a direct and devastating rebuttal. The machine does not care how glamorous the first contribution was. The machine is open to whatever you are willing to feed it. That is the miracle. Not that the amount is large, that the process is available right now with what you already have. So if you are standing at the beginning of this and all you have is $100, I want to tell you something that most people will not tell you because they are too busy trying to impress you with complexity. $100 is enough to begin. $100 is enough to prove the habit. $100 is enough to enter the long game. $100 is enough to stop rehearsing a future version of yourself and start funding one. The first month will not feel dramatic. The 6th month will not feel dramatic. The first year will not feel dramatic. That is all right. You are not buying drama. You are buying trajectory. And if you stay with it long enough, trajectory becomes transformation. A life does not change only because of huge decisions. It changes because of small decisions that were not interrupted. $100 every month, starting now, that is not a slogan. That is a machine. And the machine is open.